Hi guys, can you hear me? I'll be there in about 3 or 4 minutes. I'm just going to get a glass of water and wait for everyone to come. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm back. Terrible news about Omar. I don't know if any of you were friends with him, but if any of you need to talk, feel free to get in contact with me. If you want to talk after class tomorrow on campus or before class, I'll be in the office. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. That is say net. But yeah, there's not much. I don't know what to say. I said anyone who's not feeling up to finishing their exam, then don't worry about it. I'll make extensions at the end of the semester. I mean, I'm not sure if I can make an extension beyond the official deadline, because in the past we could do that quite easily. We'd just put in a petition to the dean, but now we've got no idea how the system works anymore. But as long as people get stuff in by the kind of before the time to put in grades, I'll grade everything. Yeah, so that's basically, and then if people need time after that, then yeah. Anyway, last class I was a little bit sick, and so I can't remember it. You know when you have a sort of cold and you're not really totally with it. I don't think it was COVID. I think so. The final is going to be also going to be a take home, and I will give you the questions. I'll write the questions over the weekend. Yeah, and so I'll give you the questions and it will be the same sort of deal, except it will be on Russell and Wittgenstein. Maybe I'll have less questions than last time because we're covering less. It was difficult to divide the assignments in the middle, yeah, because there were like 3 things and I wanted to have 2 assignments. And so the midterm was quite late and covered a lot more material than the final half of the semester. Okay, so last class I talked about the end of the Tractatus, and we talked about all this sort of crazy stuff about the unsayable. Yeah, and the question about the degree to which Wittgenstein is a mystic. I'm now going to go back to the beginning of the Tractatus, and I want to work through the first 3 sections, and then I want to talk a little bit about his views on logic. Yeah, so I gave you a handout. So, and I think that, hold on, I'm going to work through this handout. Where am I? Yeah. So I've got a handout here. So let me share it. And so if we can you see this now? It should be sitting there on the screen. So as we talked about at the beginning, that the start of the Tractatus can be divided into 3 sections. He starts off by telling us about the world. This looks like he's doing something like metaphysics. He then introduces the idea of picturing. He's offering, I think, in some sense, what we may think of as a sort of general theory of representations, what it is for one thing to represent another. Ejim, you keep freezing. Is there a problem with my connection? Should I go via my phone, or am I?
No, I can hear you well.
Okay. If my connection breaks up, just let me know. So, was that someone else? Lockman, am I breaking up? No. Okay, so I'll just carry on. So he starts off with offering an account of the world. He then offers an account of what he calls picturing, or of representation. Yeah, and it's a general account of what it is for one thing to picture another. I think this is his account of what it is for one thing to represent another, or to have representational content. So Wittgenstein's, it's something that's offering us a theory of representations. What is it? What is a representation? And representation, Wittgenstein suggests, are pictures. Yeah, all representations are pictures. And then he applies this notion of representation to thoughts and sentences. So language, the claim is that language is able to represent reality because sentences or propositions are, in a sense, pictures. And I think when he says that sentences are pictures, I think he thinks that this is literally true. Yeah, sentences literally do picture what they represent. And this is how they manage to represent. Now, when he talks about language, when he's talking about sentences, his claim here, I think, is restricted to atomic sentences, simple sentences. sentences that don't contain any logical language. So it's going to turn out that Wittgenstein's account of language is going to have two parts. First of all, there are sentences that don't contain any logical language. We can call these elementary propositions, elementary sentences. We can call these non-logical sentences. We can call them atomic sentences. So you've got purely descriptive language that in some sense says how things are in the world, that has empirical content. And then once you've got sentences with empirical content, you can create logical sentences out of this. Sentences that contain logical operators and the like. Yeah, so first of all, we offer an account of the meaning of non-logical sentences. Yep. And then we offer an account of sentences that contain logical operators. And it's going to turn out that Wittgenstein thinks that these atomic sentences, these empirical sentences, are going to all be unconnected from one another. So the truth of one doesn't essentially depend upon the truth or falsity of another. So the truth of individual empirical sentences are independent. And there's going to be no necessity in any of these claims. So all of our claims about the world, all of our empirically contentful atomic sentences are going to have the status of being contingent. Yeah. Now, once we've got this idea that all of the sentences of all of our kind of descriptive, contentful sentences are going to be contingent, I think there's a number of things that follow from this. One of the things that follows from this is that any contentful descriptive sentence, its negation must be possible. Yeah? So for any sentence that is meaningful, the negation of that sentence must also be meaningful, and it must also be possible. Yeah. So for any simple claim that doesn't contain any logical language, that the claim, first of all, its negation must be possible. That's part of what it is for a sentence to represent something contingent. This is going to be the claim that there's going to be no a priori when it comes to simple claims about the world. Yeah, there's going to be no necessity. Yeah, the second, yeah, and this is a kind of one of the things that Wittgenstein's, one of his central ideas is going to be the rejection of this Kantian idea of the synthetic a priori. The only type of necessity is going to be logical necessity, the sort of necessity you find in the truth of logic and the truth of mathematics. So Wittgenstein's working in this sort of program where he thinks that the only sort of necessity in the world is going to be logic and mathematics, and the truth of mathematics are basically logical truths. Now, so in Kantian terms, it's going to turn out that one of Wittgenstein's main claims is going to be that the only necessary truths are going to be analytic truths, truths on the basis of meaning and of logic. Secondly, it's going to turn out that because atomic sentences are sentences with empirical content, which are going to be either contingently true or false, it turns out that only such sentences are going to be meaningful. It turns out that things that are impossible can't be said. Yeah. So that you can't say anything about what is impossible. Now this is because something, if you try and say something impossible, you're going to say something meaningless. And this is going to create a problem because, or this is going to create limits, because you might think that there are certain things that are going to be impossible to say. Yeah, so you might think that there are some things that are beyond the limits of thought. Yeah, there are some things that can't be said. But it's not possible to say that there are some things that can't be said, because thinking that there are things that can't be said involves thinking what's impossible. So any attempt to say anything about what's impossible, according to the metaphysics that Wittgenstein is giving us, is going to turn out to be meaningless. And last class, we talked about the way in which Wittgenstein is committed to the idea that everything he's saying in the Tractatus is meaningless. And I think one reason for this is that Wittgenstein's telling us about stuff that he thinks is impossible. But it turns out saying stuff about what's impossible is impossible to say. Yeah, because any sentence about what's impossible is going to be meaningless. And so the sentence I just tried to say is also going to be meaningless. So all of the stuff I'm saying now turns out to be meaningless. So this is what I want to talk about today. We talked about the world. We're going to talk about his account of picturing, about representation in general. And I'm interested in Wittgenstein's theory of representation because I'm interested in the philosophy of cognitive science. And one of the biggest issues in the philosophy of cognitive science, the philosophy of psychology, the philosophy of mind, has got to do with representations. I think it's fairly standard now to think that the mind, the mental represents the world. And so that thought is essentially representational. And then the question is, well, what does that mean? What is it for one thing to represent another? It seems to me that Wittgenstein offers in the Tractatus offers a view about representational content, which is still one of the kind of standard views that people are attracted to today. Yeah, so we've got his account of picturing, and then we've got his account of language. So before I go on, any thoughts about anything I've said so far? Any questions? Okay, so we've got an account of the nature of the world. And, oh, Ejim.
Yeah, actually, I have a question. I couldn't make sense about this impossible, meaningless relation. If he claims that all the things he says are meaningless, how could he wrote a book about it, like about the impossible things?
I mean, that is the big question at the moment in Wittgenstein scholarship. So as I mentioned before, you've got these different interpretations of Wittgenstein. And I mentioned that the two camps. On the one hand, you have Cora Diamond and James Conant, who think that so one thing is Wittgenstein offering us a theory of meaning? So one sort of view is that yes, really Wittgenstein is really concerned with offering an account of how meaning works, and we should take seriously. And then the idea is that once we've in some sense grasped how this theory of meaning is work, we realize that the sentences he's used to explain this theory literally don't make sense. But these sentences have allowed us in a way to grasp a certain type of, to grasp this account of meaning. Yeah, so there's one reading of Wittgenstein where even though the sentences are, according to his own theory of meaning, meaningless, that by reading them, it allows us to, it displays something. It allows us to see something about how meaning works. Yeah. So you know, Safra, the economist, said that you know, if what can't be said can't be whistled either. And this is the sort of view that I take to be the sort of position that Wittgenstein is sort of trying to whistle it. And there's a famous paper, recent paper by PMS Hacker called "Was He Trying to Whistle It?" And Hacker's view to this is yes, that literally the sentences are meaningless, but there's going to be different types of meaningless sentences. There's going to be stuff that is completely incomprehensible. And then there's going to be stuff that allows us to intuit things, allows us to see things that can't be said. So that the sentences of the Tractatus in a sense allow us to see something about meaning, but allow us to see something that can't be put into words. Yeah, so there are things that can somehow be, there are things that we can somehow grasp that can't be put into words. Yeah, that's the sort of Hacker type of reading, which is a more, yeah. So the sort of foot is like, yeah. So you know, he talks in the. So the sort of question in the Tractatus, one of the questions is about the limits of thought or the limits of language. So what are the limits of language? And the sort of worry is to think of the limits of language, you have to think of something beyond the limits of language. So if you've got a boundary, yeah, you've got a line, and to think of something as a limit involves having some ways of thinking of something that's beyond the limit. But what's beyond the limit is going to be what's not sayable. So insofar as you want to offer an account of the limits of language, yeah, the limits, yep, you have to be able to, in some way, think about what's beyond the limits of language, what's beyond the limits of thought. And there seems to be some sort of contradiction involved there. Now, one sort of reading is that Wittgenstein is in some sense just trying to deconstruct the very notion of a theory of meaning. So one sort of reading is that we come away from this kind of thinking that any sort of attempt at a theory of meaning is going to be impossible. Yeah, and we just give up on the sort of task. Another view is that no, Wittgenstein is offering us a theory of meaning, and we're able to, even though the words he's using are words that are not that are literally meaningless, by saying them, he's allowing us to see something or intuit something, or yeah. So we have this would imply, this is the more mystical reading that suggests that we have a kind of a pre-linguistic or non-linguistic grasp of this. We can't put it into words, but we can get what Wittgenstein's saying, even though the words themselves are literally don't have any sense. I mean, these are the two sort of options. I think it's a very paradoxical. So the Tractatus starts off, it looks like it's laying the foundations of logic. It looks like he's offering a theory of meaning. But then these claims about yeah, so yeah, so this is Cora Diamond. Yeah. So my sort of reading is that he's offering a theory of meaning, but it turns out that the words he's saying, according to the theory of meaning, are meaningless. But through the activity of reading it, we're able to, this sort of understanding of meaning is revealed to us. So Wittgenstein's trying to show us something he can't say. Yeah, so this theory of meaning he's trying to show us that we can't say. Now, Cora Diamond says, this sort of account, she says, I want to call chickening out. You're being a coward if you go this route. Yeah, so he says, what counts as not chickening out is this then, roughly. To throw the latter away is, amongst other things, to throw away in the end the attempt to take seriously the language of features of reality. To read Wittgenstein himself as not chickening out is to say it is not really his view that there are features of reality that cannot be put into words but show themselves. That this sort of resolute reading says, no, the nonsense of the Tractatus is real nonsense. It really doesn't, he's not showing us anything. Yeah. What he's revealing to us is the sort of the failure of philosophy and the impossibility of philosophy. What he's revealing to us is that any attempt to offer an account of meaning or to answer these questions is sort of futile. Yeah. So there's these sort of two ways of reading Wittgenstein, the Tractatus. There are these two camps of, yeah, Ejim?
And you said earlier that he failed in philosophy. Why did he think so? Like,
okay.
Why did his whole philosophy failed according to him?
Okay, so I think on my reading, this is the reading of Hacker, or my reading is close to the reading of Hacker, is that I think he really was offering a theory of meaning in the Tractatus, and he's sort of committed to this sort of theory of meaning, even though he realizes it's a theory that ultimately can't be put into words. Yeah, but it's a kind of, and he's got a sort of orientation to meaning that can't be put into words. My reading is that he later came to see that this theory of meaning was false. Yeah, and so in the 1930s, he came across sort of problems. So he thinks that all statements about the world are, there's no necessity in the world. The only sort of necessity is logical necessity. Yeah, and logical necessity involves logical truth. It turns out, though, that he came to see that there are some sort of necessities in the world that can't be explained purely in terms of logical necessities. So in particular, for example, the fact that this is red excludes its being green. So let's suppose you're committed to sense data theory and you point to a particular sense datum. Yeah. Now this patch is being red, or this surface is being red, sort of excludes its being green. And that seems to be a sort of necessity, a sort of real necessity in nature, yeah, that is not purely logical. And so I think Wittgenstein so my reading of Wittgenstein is that he was sort of committed to a theory of meaning. What he's offering us is a theory of meaning. And it's a theory of meaning that turns out that according to its own light, the sentences used to express this theory of meaning are not empirical and don't have any empirical content. They're not the sort of sentence, they're not scientific sentences. Yeah. So Wittgenstein basically thinks there are two types of sentence. There are or two types of true sentence. There are true scientific claims about the world, yeah, which are ultimately going to be reducible into atomic sentences that have empirical content. So you have empirical truths, and you have truths of logic. Yeah, so you're going to have logical truths and mathematical truths. Yeah, so there are these two types of true sentences: empirical claims, which are about the world, and then you've got logical claims that are analytic truths. Yeah, and this is going to cover mathematics. What about the statements of philosophy? And it turns out philosophical claims are neither empirical, they're not empirical truths, they're not truths of science, and they're not analytically true. So he's got a theory of truths where he thinks there are these two types of truths. And then the truths of philosophy, and then the statements of philosophy are not going to fit into either camp. Yeah, so I think And so at the time of the Tractatus, it's like, the statements of philosophy then are not really truth apt at all. Yeah. I think at the time of writing the Tractatus, he thought that philosophy then, rather than kind of stating truths, is more like poetry. So that the task of philosophy is to sort of create a certain type of reorientation. Yeah, so it changes the way you look at things. So my reading is I think I take him at face value and think, yes, he is sort of committed to this theory of meaning. And it's a theory of meaning where you can divide all truths into empirical truths. These are the truths of atomic sentences, and then logical truths. These are the analytic truths. And then philosophical claims are not truth apt. Yeah, but they can have some other function. They can have the function of allowing the reader to be reoriented in a certain way and to come to see things. Yeah, they can help us, they can show us things that can't be said. Yeah. So by the time of the 1930s, though, he came back to philosophy, and I think he came to see that this distinction between the purely empirical and the purely logical broke down. Yeah, that he started to see the kind of problem of the reality of necessities that were not purely logical necessities. Yeah, and as he tried to deal with this, his view of language changed quite radically, and he came to see meaning not in terms of something like correspondence, not in terms of representation, not in terms of picturing, but in terms of use. Yeah, so words get their meaning in terms of something like their inferential roles. And so grasping them, so according to the Tractatian picture of meaning, that sentences picture reality. Yeah, and so to grasp the meaning of something is to grasp what must be the case were the accurate. Yeah. By the time of the kind of later philosophy, he's changed his view of meaning, and he's got the idea, he kind of has the idea of meaning is use. So to grasp the meaning of a word is to know how to use it in a sort of language game. And yeah, so, and another thing is that at the time of the Tractatus, that I think Wittgenstein, these sort of atomic sentences are not going to be the sentences of English or German. Yeah, atomic sentences are going to be, I think most of our sentences that we actually use when we're talking to each other are not purely descriptive. Yeah, they've got a whole bunch of logical content. So Wittgenstein, I think, is offering an account not of English, not of German. He's offering an account of meaning in a sort of idealized scientific language. So what he's offering an account of is not the meaning of ordinary language, but he's offering an account of meaning in an ideal, fully analyzed language. And the sort of thought is that our everyday language hopefully can be analyzed in such a way that we can divide it up into the empirical content plus the logical commitments. Yeah. By the kind of 1930s, I think he's moved away from the idea of offering an account of some sort of ideal language. And what he wants to offer us is an account of meaning in our everyday language. Yeah, so there's a sort of, I think there are a bunch of quite radical shifts between the early Wittgenstein and the later Wittgenstein. But of course, yeah, so Ulku asked me, would Wittgenstein categorize being square excludes being round as a natural necessity or a purely logical necessity? I mean, yeah, once again, that he talks about red and green in the 1930s. yeah, but so one problem with Wittgenstein interpretation has got to do with how to understand what Wittgenstein says. Hold on, is Urku there? Oh yeah, yeah. So what Wittgenstein says about predicates and relations. So when we look at his account of the world, yeah, so the world is a totality of facts, not things. Yeah, the fact is the existence of a state of affairs. So a state of affairs is a possible way the world could be. Yeah, and a state of affairs is a combination of objects. Yeah. Now, on my reading, so there's sort of disagreements about interpreting Wittgenstein. What sort of objects are there in his metaphysics? And on my reading, that the objects you get in states of affairs are going to be individuals, properties, and relations. So the sorts of objects you're going to have are going to be places, individuals. You could think of objects you could think of as positions in space or points in space. And then points in space can have properties and they can have relations. Yeah. So when it comes to states of affairs, I'm thinking that and Wittgenstein sort of wants to remain neutral on what the ultimate states of affairs are, what the ultimate objects are. But I think one way of thinking about his view about the sort of objects you're going to get are going to be places or individuals or points. You're going to have properties, so like being read, and you're going to have relations. Now, are things like being circular and being square, are these names of objects? If they're names of objects, then I think Wittgenstein. So I'm still trying to answer Ulku's question. So if they're names of objects, then if being square and being round are real properties, yeah, if is round is a name of an object, name of a property, and is square is the name of a property, then I think that we're going to have Wittgenstein's going to have exactly the same problem as he has with is red and is green. Yeah, that it looks like these properties exclude one another, and the exclusion doesn't seem to be a matter of logic. It seems to be something about the nature of the world. Now, I suspect Wittgenstein may think that being square and being round are not ultimate properties, and so that maybe we can analyze being square and being round into other things. So we've got a bunch of points, yeah, and so maybe being square and being round are not simple properties, but it involves some sort of logical complexity. Now, I'm not sure what Wittgenstein would say here. I think for him, being red and being green, I think when he's thinking of the world, I think that he's still quite influenced by Russell and Russell's view about sense data. So I'm thinking of the world as, a set of points, yeah, that can have certain sensible qualities, like being read, and have certain sort of spatial relations to one another. So we might think of the world as a kind of an array of sensible, perceivable qualities standing in spatial relations to one another. And then it seems to me that being square and being round may not be basic properties, but may be properties of sets of points. Yeah, so it's not like a single object is round, but that being round is a kind of higher order property that, yeah, so the fact the fact that there is a circle there, this yeah, being circular may be something more like being a fact than being an object. Whereas I think being red is a kind of unanalyzable property. And so on my understanding of the sort of ontology of the Tractatus, what a state of affair is a combination of objects, and the objects are going to be maybe something like points. They're going to be sensible qualities like being red and being green, and they're going to be certain types of relations like being to the left of, being to the right of. Yeah, I take it the basic, at the very least, there are going to be spatial relations between objects. Yeah. So, Ulku, does that answer your question, or do you have any follow-up question? So I think if you think of being square and being round as properties that objects can have, then I think you're going to have the same sort of problem with these sort of things. My guess is, though, that yeah, my sort of suggestion is that Wittgenstein could just say that being red, square, and being round are not properties of objects, but you know, if you've got a bunch of points organized in a certain way, then you've got a circle. So a circle is a set of points standing in certain relations to one another. Yeah. So for there to be a circle is for there to be this is going to be a matter of being a fact. That's going to be a state of affairs rather than a property, because being circular has got to do with a set of individuals, a set of points standing in a certain relation to each other. So we've got the world. Yeah. Picturing. How does picturing work? So we picture facts to ourselves, and a picture is a model of reality. In a picture, objects have the elements of the picture corresponding to them. So for a picture to work, there's got to be elements in the picture that correspond to elements in reality, correspond to objects. Yeah. In a picture, the elements of the picture are the representatives of objects. And what constitutes a picture is that its elements are related to one another in a determinate way. So in a picture, you've got a bunch of elements that you may have on the space, and these elements are related to one another in a determinate way. And the idea is that for a picture to represent reality, that the elements of the picture have to pick out elements in reality, and then the ways of recombining elements in the picture corresponds to the ways of recombining objects in the world. Yeah. So and the Wittgenstein's got an idea of possibility as sort of combination. Yeah. So we've got this idea of possibilities as something like combinatorics. So you've got a bunch of elements in the world. Let's suppose you've got a world with 3 things in it. These 3 things. And then there are various possibilities the world could have. Let's suppose that the only sort of relations are being to the left or to the right. So you've got these 3 things, and they can be ordered ABC, ACB, BCA, BAB, so BAC. Yeah. So you've got the objects in the world, and the objects in the world can be, there are certain configurations the objects in the world can have. That gives you, that's all the possibilities there are in reality, all the ways the world could be. And then a good picture picks out each element out there in the world, and then the possibilities of recombining things in the picture correspond to the possibilities of that the objects in the world could be recombined. Yeah. Does this make sense? So he looked at this case of a court case where you had a car accident on the streets of Paris. And then in the courthouse, they had a model of the accident. And maybe in the model, you had a street, you had a model car, and then you had two model people. Now, the places where all of these things can be in the model correspond to where things could have been in reality. Yeah. So the possibility of recombining things in the model corresponds to the ways in which the things in reality could have been recombined. Yeah. And this is only possible if the picture and the thing pictured have something in common. Yeah. So what is he says? What a picture must have in common with reality in order to be able to depict it correctly or incorrectly in the way that it does is its pictorial form. Now, in the court case that we've got the reality, and the form of reality is a three-dimensional spatial form. Yeah? That the model in the court is also a three-dimensional form. And it's because you're using three-dimensional space to represent three-dimensional space that any sort of reconfigurations of objects in the model is going to correspond to reconfigurations in reality. Yeah. So a picture can depict any reality whose form it has. A spatial picture can depict anything spatial, a colored one, anything colored. Yeah. Now, the pictorial form makes representation possible. Yeah. But he said a picture cannot, however, depict its pictorial form. It displays it. Yeah. So you've got the form of the picture, the form of reality. And what a picture represents is its sense. Now, this is that he's taking this sort of Fregean notion, distinction between sense and reference. I take it what a sense is, what the sense of a picture is what it's representing is a possible way the world could be. So what pictures represent are states of affairs, and states of affairs are ways the world could be. Yeah, and the agreement or disagreement of its sense with reality constitutes its truth or falsity. So a picture represents a way in which the thing represented could be, and a picture is true or accurate if things are as it so depicts. So this is the account of picturing. Any questions about this? Jem, does this make sense? You're the only person I could see, and I wonder. I mean, this sort of stuff. I'm wondering whether I'm saying too much because it's too easy, or whether it's not making any sense at all. But does this conception of picturing sort of make sense to you? This idea of reference?
Yeah, like having models and models representing the reality, and the changes in the models have to have to be in harmony with the reality. It does make sense to me. Yeah.
Okay, Lockman, does this? I mean, so according to the Resolute reading, yeah, if it makes sense to you, there's something horribly gone wrong because it's all nonsense. Yeah, so yeah, Wittgenstein makes that if it makes sense to you, yeah, you haven't understood me because it's all nonsense. Yeah, and Hacker's going to say no. If it makes sense to you, that's great, but you've just got to realize that if it does make sense to you, you've got to realize that the actual words that I'm using are not descriptive of anything. Yeah, Lockman, is this? I mean, any thoughts about this?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, firstly, mostly I turn off my camera because I have two nasty cats. They're always sleeping somewhere. because of this, I always
Yeah.
turn off the camera. And the question about Wittgenstein, I don't have a problem
Okay.
about it. You know, did you know I'm also a master student?
Yeah.
It's before in Hacettepe we study on that text,
Mhm.
so it's not a problem for me, I guess.
Okay. That's cool. Okay, so shall we have a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come to language, which is where things get a bit tricky, because we can understand how a kind of a three-dimensional model can be used to model a three-dimensional an accident in space. Yeah, so we've got a model, and we can understand in some sense how the form of the model corresponds to the form of reality. Yeah, and how for this allows us, this gives us in some sense the possibility of recombining things in the model corresponds to the possibility of recombining things in reality. Yeah, and so we get this idea of the shared form. The kind of tricky question is, in what sense does language share a form with reality? So in what sense, in what sense can we make of the idea that in linguistic representations there's a shared form between language and the world? And it's this shared form that allows linguistic devices to represent things in reality. Yeah. I think one last thing about pictures that I didn't include this quote, but in the world we've got facts. A world is a set of facts. According to Wittgenstein's view of pictures, one of the central things about his view of pictures is pictures themselves are facts. So pictures are things that exist in the world. Yeah, pictures are not. They don't exist in some outside of the world. But pictures themselves exist in the same reality, in the same world as that what they picture. Yeah, so if the world consists of facts, then pictures themselves are facts. Yeah, pictures themselves are things that exist in the world. And I think this claim about pictures being facts, of being parts of the world, is going to play a role in understanding how language can depict, and also explaining for Wittgenstein the unity of the proposition, what it is that makes a sentence unified in a certain way. That's something I missed out from this view of pictures. Okay, so let's talk about language after the break. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay. Hi guys, sorry about that. Alijan is teething, so yeah, everything is difficult. Okay, so any questions about what we were talking, what I was talking about last time? Okay, so now, if not, I want to talk about his views on language. So on this handout I made, I tried to go through the language discussion and pull out what I took to be the kind of key claims. So a thought, yeah, so we've got thoughts are logical pictures of facts. So he introduces this idea of a logical picture. So why do you think thoughts, when he says logical picture, why doesn't he just say a picture of facts is a thought? Why do you think he thinks, do you think he says logical picture here? What's the contrast?
Maybe he wants to emphasis on the emphasis. He wants to put an emphasis on the distinction about true sentences, like the one you said, like the descriptive ones, the empirical ones versus the logical ones.
I mean,
maybe he is not trying to say that this is not a descriptive picture, but there is logical operator.
Well, yeah, so I think that would, I mean, I can see why you might think that, given what I've just said, because we've got a notion of the distinction between elementary propositions and logical propositions. But I take it the contrast he's making is between a spatial picture. So up until when he first introduces the idea of pictures, we've got the idea of spatial pictures, either a model of the courtroom, it's something in space. So, and I take it the thought is that in a spatial picture, that what the picture shares with the thing pictured, what the representation shares with the thing that's represented is spatial form. Yeah, so what makes a spatial picture spatial is that it has spatial form, and that's what it shares with what it's pictured. A logical picture is a picture that's going to, what it's going to share with the thing pictured is going to be logical form, whatever that is. So a logical picture is something that shares a logical representation, a logical picture is something that shares logical form with the thing pictured. And I take it that when we're talking about logical form here, we're not talking about logic in terms of logical operators, because even an elementary proposition with no logical operators has a certain logical form. And I mean, when we're thinking about logical form, I think the most basic type of logical form is going to be predication. In a sentence, in a thought, what you have in a thought is a subject and a predicate. And a simple thought. Let's forget about relations for the time being. So a logical picture, the form of a logical picture, or at least one type of form of a logical picture, is going to be the subject predicate form. And then I take it that the way in which a subject predicate picture representation can represent the thing pictured is if the thing represented has the same sort of form. So you've got, reality has the same form as language, you might think. If the logical form of language is subject predicate form, then you might think reality can share a form with language is if we've got the same sort of form in reality. And then you might think, oh, yes, we have the same sort of form in reality, because in reality we have individuals and properties. Yeah, so you might think, well, we've got substances and their properties, and the subject predicate form of judgment in some sense, shares a form with the kind of substance property relationship in reality. I think this is the sort of idea. This is something that goes back at least to Kant. So in the table of judgments and table of categories, the first judgment of relation is predication. A is B. Yeah, and then Kant thinks that this is related on the objectual side to the idea of a substance and its properties. Yeah, so somehow reality shares a form with judgment. This is going to be the picture. So a logical picture of facts is a thought, and what makes a picture a logical picture is it has logical form rather than, say, merely spatial form. And I think the sort of example of logical form, an example of logical form is going to be predication. And now we have thoughts. Then he says in a proposition, so the word proposition is a difficult one. The German here is Satz, which could be translated as sentence. Yeah, I think by proposition, what Wittgenstein means is something like a meaningful sentence. So a proposition is a meaningful sentence. So he says, in a proposition, a thought finds an expression that can be perceived by the senses. So a sentence is something public, it's visible. If I write down a sentence on a bit of paper, and in some sense, this written sentence on paper is the expression of a thought that can be perceived by the senses. He says, I call the sign with which we express a thought a propositional sign. So a propositional sign, sometimes he says proposition, is going to be a sort of meaningful sentence, a meaningful string of words. Yeah, so we're gonna have things that may look like sentences, that may look like, yeah, but aren't, because they don't express thoughts. It's going to turn out that most of the sentences of the Tractatus turn out not to be propositional signs because they don't express thoughts. Yeah. And a proposition is a propositional sign in its projective relation to the world. So a kind of, I mean, this is a weird thing. So it's not exactly clear what he's saying here. But a proposition is not just it's not just a string of letters organized grammatically correctly. Yeah, we might think we have words, and then we have rules of grammar, rules of syntax that tell us what sort of combinations of words is well ordered grammatically. Yeah, and we might have a view of language that says a kind of a proposition is any well ordered string of symbols that's well formed. But I think Wittgenstein wants to say that in order to be a proposition, a string of symbols has to have some sort of representational content. Yeah, so a proposition is a propositional sign in its projective relationship to the world. It's an interpreted set of symbols. It's symbols that have some empirical content. Now, in a proposition, in a sentence, a thought can be expressed in such a way, yeah, that elements of the propositional sign correspond to the objects of the thought. Yeah, so in a proposition is a complex entity. This is why propositions are going to be something like facts. Yeah, so a fact is something that is a combination of objects. It's a fact. A state of affairs is a certain way a set of objects could be combined together. A fact is a particular organization of a set of objects. Ejim is sitting on her chair. I think I can't see your chair, but I guess you are. So there you've got two objects, Ejim and the chair, and there's the relation of sitting on. Maybe there's three things. There's edgem, the chair, and then the relationship between them. And a proposition, in a proposition, a thought can be expressed in such a way that elements of the propositional sign, so elements of the sentence, correspond to the objects of the thought. Yeah, so parts of the sentence correspond to the objects that are the objects of the thought. So I'm taking it that relations and properties are objects in this sense. Yeah, so in a sentence, we might have edgem is happy. And in that sentence, there are two elements. There's the name edgem, and then there is happy. And both of these name objects. Yeah, the edgem is the name of an individual. Is happy is the name of a property. Yeah, so in my reading of Wittgenstein, he's what's known, using the word in its sort of medieval sense. I take it that in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein is a sort of realist about universals. Yeah, the other view is nominalism, which says all there are individuals, there are properties, there are relations. My sort of reading of the Tractatus is that Wittgenstein thinks that amongst the objects are individuals, properties, and relations. And then if this sort of reading is right, then in a sentence, you have a bunch of names. You have the name of an object, of an individual, plus the name of a property. And the elements of the propositional sign correspond to the objects of the thought. Yeah, so in a subject predicate judgment, there are two elements in the sign, in the sentence. There's the subject term and the predicate term. The subject term and the predicate term are names. The subject term names an individual. The predicate term names a property. Yeah. Now, he says, I call such elements simple signs, and such propositions completely analyzed. So a completely analyzed proposition is a proposition that's expressed purely in terms of simple signs. Yeah. So a fully analyzed proposition is just going to contain names of subjects, of predicates, and of relations. Yeah, this is my reading. The simple signs employed in propositions are called names. Now, so in English, when we talk about names, when we talk about names, we think of proper names. Yeah. Now I think Wittgenstein thinks that. Sorry, Ali Jan is really crying. I'm getting a bit disturbed. Could you hear him in the background? He's really, yeah, he's teething at the moment, and I mean, it's so sad because he's just crying all the time. Yesterday, Zubaydi was teaching for 6 hours, and also when he's like this, he really wants his mummy. Yeah, so yeah, but even with mummy, it's like, yeah, it's not completely good enough. Yeah, okay. So I'm giving you a particular reading of Wittgenstein now, of the Tractatus, which I think is the sort of simplest reading and the easiest reading, which is to think of a sentence, a simple sentence consists of simple signs. A completely analyzed bit of language is going to be expressed in terms of atomic propositions, and it's going to consist of a bunch of names. We have names of individuals and names of properties, yeah, and names of relations. Yeah. Now, yep, and a name means an object. Yeah. The object is its meaning. here I think here the German is Bedeutung. I think means here could mean I think this is what today we would translate as reference. A main refers to an object, and the object is its meaning. So the meaning of a name is the thing it refers to. Yeah. Now, the configurations of objects in a situation corresponds to the configuration of simple signs in the propositional sign. And now, I think the way in which we could reorganize so one thing that's going to turn out is that there are rules that determine the way in which the possibility of recombining bits of language in a way, strings of letters that are grammatically correct. So we've got something like the laws of grammar, and the laws of grammar, or the laws of syntax, tell us which ways we're allowed to recombine words in a sentence. So let's suppose we've got egem, we've got loves, and we've got nas. Grammatically, we can say egem loves nas, we can say nas loves egem. Yeah, we can't say egem nas loves. That's not grammatically correct. Yeah. So the laws of grammar, the grammatical laws of English, and I think sometimes Wittgenstein thinks of these as the laws of syntax, yeah, tell us what's possible on the linguistic side. And the sort of idea is that in a well-functioning language, yeah, the laws for recombining, the laws of grammar that tell us what's permissible in terms of what makes a meaningful sentence on the side of language correspond to the possible ways things could be in the world. So there's going to be a correspondence. There's a sort of pre-established harmony. It's not clear exactly the basis of this correspondence, but there's going to be a correspondence between what's legitimately combinable linguistically and what's possible in the world. Now, this is a bit weird because on the side of the language, the rules of grammar they're not like laws of physics. Yeah, they're sort of normative laws. They're laws about what counts as a grammatically correct sentence. Yeah. So when we say you can't say egem nas loves, the can't there is a normative, because I just said it. I just put those words together in the wrong order. Yeah. So the laws that govern the combination of symbols in a sentence, these grammatical laws, these syntactic laws, are normative laws. Yeah, they can be broken. We can put together words in a way that is impermissible. So the sort of impossibility of saying egem nas loves is not a physical impossibility, but somehow the normative rules that govern the proper formation of sentences, yeah, are basically constraints on the possible combination of words. They're normative constraints. They tell you what combination of words is permissible grammatically. But these rules that concern the way in which words can be ordered, simple signs can be ordered within a sentence, somehow correspond to what's really possible in the world. So the ways of possibly reordering signs within a sentence corresponds to what's really possible in the world. Yeah, and if you can't, and so if you put words together in a way that's grammatically in, if you put signs, okay, it's difficult to put this. If you put strings of letters together in a way that's grammatically incorrect, you haven't said anything. Yeah, you haven't said something that's impossible. You haven't given a description of what's impossible. You've just failed to say anything. Yeah. So that we can't say what's impossible, but the laws of grammar basically put a limit on what it's possible to say. And anything that we can't say is impossible. But I just said it, and what I just said, I can't say. This is the sort of Wittgensteinian thing, yeah. Yeah. So the configurations of objects in a situation corresponds to the configuration of simple signs in the propositional sign, and only propositions have sense. So this is has anyone read Frege? So Frege, in his I think in the Foundations of Arithmetic, he introduces this idea called the context principle, which is the principle that a word only has meaning in the context of a sentence. So the basic units of meaning for Wittgenstein are sentences, and a word, so only propositions have sense. Only in the nexus of a proposition does a name have a meaning. Yeah, so only in the nexus of a proposition does a name have a meaning. Now, so if I say something ungrammatical, I haven't said anything. If I say Ecem Naz love, then I'm not using Ecem or Naz or loves as names. I've got a string of words, yeah, but I haven't said anything. That I use the string of letters Ecem, but Ecem is not functioning as a simple sign. If I use a word incorrectly and ungrammatically, I mean, in some sense, it sounds the same as a word, it sounds the same as a name, but I'm not using it as a name. If I say Ecem hunkety donkety, what does that mean? It's meaningless. I've said something that sounds like the name Ecem, but I haven't actually used the name. Yeah, so we've got a distinction between strings of symbols and strings of letters and simple signs. A simple sign is a string of symbols that's been interpreted, that refers to something. But a string of symbols can only be interpreted in the context of a sentence. That's one thing. The second thing, sorry, there's some questions. But life does not fit into logical grammar. Isn't that squeezing reality into a grammar? Well, yeah. And one thing is that for Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, you know, there's a single grammar as well. There's a single grammar that rules everything. Yeah, there's a single logical form. By the time of the philosophical investigations, he's got away from this simple idea of grammar. You've got things like language games, and different language games have their own grammars. Yeah, so one of the things about his later work is he came, the idea of grammar became in some sense even more central, but it turns out you have different grammars ruling different bits of language. Yeah, so we have a whole bunch of different language games, and the sort of implicit rules that govern the use of language. Yeah, so Wittgenstein's got he develops a very idiosyncratic notion of grammar. Yeah, in his later work, one of his kind of, between this and the between the Tractatus and the Philosophical Investigations, one of the transitional works is called Philosophical Grammar. And grammar for Wittgenstein are the sort of implicit rules that govern the sort of use of a particular fragment of language. And these sort of rules are meaning constitutive. They determine what is and what is not meaningless. Yeah, so you said, but life does not fit into logical grammar. Isn't that squeezing reality into a grammar? So one of the things I want to talk about next week has got to do with whether Wittgenstein is an idealist or not. Yeah, so is he a realist? Does the world exist independent of thought, of language? And Wittgenstein very famously says in the Threes, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Yeah, so we've got certain grammatical forms, and these grammatical forms determine what's thinkable, what's representable. And Wittgenstein's world is the world insofar as it can be thought, insofar as it can be represented. Now, but many people read the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus as a realist who thinks that we start off with the idea of the world and then language somehow fits to the world. Other Wittgenstein scholars, though, read Wittgenstein as an idealist. That in some sense, the world for us is the world that can be represented by us. Yeah, so the only possible world is the world insofar as it can be thought. And if Wittgenstein's right in his theory of representation, the only way to represent something is if there's some sort of shared form. And therefore, the world can only be thought by us insofar and to the degree that it shares the form of language. Yeah, but what about the world as it is in itself? And the sort of Wittgenstein sort of thought is the world as it is in itself is something that can't be thought because it can't be represented. The idea of the world, what about the world beyond the limits of language? And because, the whole point of what can't be said is we can't say anything about the world independent of language. The world as it is in itself, beyond the limits of thought, beyond the limits of language, because linguistically we cannot refer to that which can't. Linguistically, we can't refer to that which we can't refer to. Lokman.
I will say it, same thing at Hacettepe. One of our professor was said Tractatus is a very Kantian book.
Yeah, who is that? Which teacher was that?
Harun Tepe, Professor Harun
Okay,
Tepe.
I know Harun Tepe. My wife did her PhD at Hacettepe. Yeah, in philosophy. Yeah, yes. I mean, there are questions about the degree to which it is Kantian. The sort of idea, though, that language and reality must share something in common if language is able to represent the world. Yep. Now, the world as it is in itself, I think Wittgenstein thinks that we can't even have a concept of the world as it is independently of language. Now, this is something that we, because the sentence, the phrase, the world as it is independently of language, doesn't have any meaning. What does it refer to? Yeah. We've got something that is ineffable. Yeah. So this is the sort of problem. Okay, so only propositions have sense. Only in the nexus of a proposition does a name have a meaning. Now, one of the worries that Wittgenstein was concerned with was about the unity of the proposition. Yeah, the unity of the proposition. So Russell had thought of a proposition as a set of names. So, you know, Ejim loves, sorry, I keep saying Ejim loves Naz just because you're next to each other on my screen. And I hope you're not, I mean, I could change the example a little bit, yeah, but maybe you hate each other, I don't know. But so we might think here, we've got three names. We've got Ejim, we've got Loves, and we've got Naz. Yeah, so we've got three names. We've got the name of an individual, we've got the name of a relation, and we've got the name of another individual. And you might think, well, in the sentence, you've just got these three names. But what is it that holds them together? What is it that kind of gives unity to the judgment? What is it that gives unity to the thought? Now, one view about the unity of the proposition is that it's sort of psychological. Yeah, that you have this is a sort of Kantian view. You have a sort of judging subject, and it's the existence of the judging subject that provides unity to the proposition. Yeah. So Ejim is happy. I think Ejim is happy. And in some sense, in thought, I bring these two things together. But these Ejim and is happy are things that are kind of, in some sense, Ejim and happiness are these two separate things that are somehow brought together in thought by the thinking subject. So one view about the unity of a thought is the unity of the thought is supplied by the judging subject. This is in some sense what you might think of as the Kantian view. Wittgenstein wants to reject this. Now, Frege had a view about the unity of the judgment. And does anyone know how Frege sort of dealt with this idea of what it is about the unity of the judgment? What does a judgment involve? Any idea for Frege? So Frege was very much against psychologism in logic. So any sort of view that makes the subject central in judgment, he wants to get away from that. He wants it all to be objective. So he wants thought, logic to be objective, to not depend upon anything subjective, like a subject bringing things together in thought. So Frege sort of thought that a judgment had a sort of unity that was not dependent on the subject. It wasn't a subjective unity. It has some sort of objective unity. Anyone know what he thought? So he thought that in a judgment, you always had two things. You have something saturated and you have something unsaturated. Yeah, so you have objects, you have names that pick out objects. Yeah, and then you have concepts. Yeah, and concepts are kind of what Frege called unsaturated entities. So properties are always in need of an object to inhere in. Yeah, so you've got is red, and you've got is happy, and you've got Ejim. And here you've got the name of an individual plus the name of a concept. Yeah, and a concept needs to be combined with an individual to have meaning. Yeah. Now, his view of concepts are weird. He thinks concepts are functions from objects to truth values. So you have an object and you've got a function, and so you've got Ejim. You pick out Ejim, and then the function is happy. Has got to do with the judgment Ejim is happy is either true or false. And the concept is kind of determined by what situations would lead to the judgment being true. you don't need to worry too much about Frege on concepts. So Frege's got an account of judgment such that you've got two fundamentally distinct types of objects. You've got kind of individuals or objects, things, and then you've got these concepts. And concepts are essentially incomplete, and they need to be combined with some individual. Yeah, yeah. And it's only when you get them both together, you end up with a unified judgment that can be either true or false. So the reference for Frege, the meaning of a sentence is a truth value, and concepts are functions from individuals to truth values. Yeah, so you have a, and so you can think of the relationship between, in a whole sentence, you've got an argument and you've got a function. Yeah, so the object, Ecem, is an argument, the concept is a function, and you bind them all together and you get a truth value. Yeah, and so, you know, Frege's got a nice account of what it is that unifies a judgment. One thing is he's got this radical distinction between objects and concepts, and so red is the name of a concept, not the name of an object. But what about sentences like red is a concept? That seems to be true. But red doesn't name an object, it names a concept. It names a function. And a function cannot be the argument of another function. Yeah, so Frege has a real problem explaining the meaning of a sentence such as red is a concept. It seems to be nonsense on Frege's account of meaning. Yeah. So Frege's got this view that you've got names of individuals or names of objects or names of things, whatever you want to call that. And then you've got things like properties, which are names of concepts. So there's a radical distinction between objects and concepts, between objects and, say, properties, something like that. And because properties are concepts, they're essentially functions, and they're in need of some argument. It's only once you've got an argument and you put it into the function that you get a sort of result. Now, now Russell didn't like this. So Russell think, no, you've got all these names, Ecem and Loves and Nas, and they're all names of an individual, names of a relation, name of an individual. So that each of the three things names something out there. But then how do you explain the unity of the proposition? What's the difference between a judgment and just like a string of names? Yeah, because if the objects are kind of combined together, that seems to be central. And that's something that Russell has a kind of problem explaining. Now, any idea what Wittgenstein thinks about this? Any sort of thought about what Wittgenstein thinks about this? So next class, why don't you think about it? That I'll give you a clue. So in some sense, the clue is that in some sense, facts are more basic than, facts are more basic than objects. Yeah, objects, yeah, if a thing can occur in a state of affairs, the possibility of the state of affairs must be written into the thing itself. Yeah. If I know an object, I also know all its possible occurrences in states of affairs. Every one of these possibilities must be part of the nature of the object. Yeah. If all the objects are given, then at the same time, all possible states of affairs are also given. Yeah. And the possibility of occurring in states of affairs is the form of an object. So, and I think we've got something similar going on at the level of language. So Frege, I think Wittgenstein thinks that understanding a name like Egem isn't just to understand a sign and its reference, but also involves grasping the grammar that governs the term. So Egem is a name, and given it's a name, we know what it sort of purportedly refers to, but we know the way in which it can be combined with other signs to form meaningful sentences. And that's going to be part of the meaning of the term. Yeah, the syntactic rules that govern its combinations. So in some sense, Wittgenstein goes a step beyond Frege and thinks all objects are incomplete. Yeah, all objects in some sense need the possibility of combinations in states of affairs. The idea of an object existing by itself doesn't make any sense. Objects are things that can exist within states of affairs. And states of affairs are basically basic. Yeah? And the possibility of occurring within states of affairs is written in to the nature of the objects. And the possibility of occurring in meaningful sentences is written in to meaningful signs. So a name is not just like a name, it's not just like a label of an object. To understand a name isn't just to understand what it refers to, but to understand a name as a name involves understanding it as a linguistic entity with a certain grammatical role, which involves understanding which sorts of other linguistic entities it can be combined with. Yeah, and this is why he thinks that the unity of the proposition is accounted for by the rules that govern. Yeah, that a name is only a name in the context of a sentence. So Egem isn't a sentence. Yeah, if you just have a name by itself, you could have a call, a request, but there maybe you've got an implicit but a name by itself doesn't say anything. Yeah, and so Wittgenstein thinks the name by itself is meaningless. Now, at the beginning of the investigations, he gives an example of a language in which you just have names by themselves. I think this is something that where you have a certain sort of practice where you say slab, and that means bring me a slab. But I think at this time, he's thinking that a name by itself isn't a name. It's just a sound that sounds. It sounds like a name, but it's not a name. A name is only a propositional sign within a sentence. Yeah. So an element, a proposition of a sort can be expressed in such a way that elements of the propositional sign correspond to the objects of thought. I call such elements simple signs. Yeah. So a simple sign, like a name, it's going to be an element of a proposition, and you take the string of letters out of the sentence and it stops being a name. Yeah, because to be a name involves functioning as a name, and it involves being a name involves being in a sentence that has a certain syntactic or grammatical structure. Okay, so I think that's enough for today. Next class, I'll try and say a bit more about language. Then I wanted to talk about philosophy. And so I was going to talk about, starting on page 29, we've got this discussion of philosophy, and in some sense, the sort of worry we've got is we've got some worry about the impossibility of philosophy, because we've got these two meaningful use of languages. We've got the propositions of science, which are making empirical claims. We've got these logical claims, logical truths, which gives us mathematics and logic. But then what about philosophy? And philosophical claims seem to be neither logical truths nor empirical truths. Therefore, there doesn't seem to be any room for philosophy. This is the kind of anti-Kantian side. So, Kant thinks that the claims of philosophy are synthetic a priori, and then he creates space in his system for the synthetic a priori. Wittgenstein, I think, quite explicitly wants to deny this. This is a central part of his view in the Tractatus, that we've got empirical claims that are sort of synthetic a posteriori and are all contingent. And then we've got claims of mathematics and logic, which are all basically analytic and necessary. Yep. And there isn't any room for claims that are sort of non-empirical and non-logical. Yeah. And therefore, it looks like we haven't got room for philosophy or metaphysics. And this is, I think, what he wants to argue for. But then it turns out that all of his claims about language also, what are they supposed to be? Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow at 4. Is it 4? 3, yeah. Okay, ciao.